Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at association. Just in the interest of time, to save a bit of time, I've drawn up the classes, but I've not drawn the associations themselves, and I will do that as part of this explanation, but I've just drawn the four classes. You would also notice from the previous video that one of the best ways to understand, and the right way probably, to understand all these relationships is to look at it, what actually happens from a code level, and then see what we mean by these various kinds of relationships. Or another way of saying it, every time we are drawing one of these notations, there is an implication in terms of the code that it actually means. So we need to understand it both ways. So given that we probably are used to writing more code rather than diagrams, so I'm going to start looking at what exactly it means from a code level and then try and map it back to what happens at a model level or at a diagram level. So let's start with association. I have class A and class B here, and if I simply draw this association, if I can draw that right, I don't think it picked up correctly. Let me do that. Okay, that's better. What this actually means from a code level is that class A actually has a member of type class B, and in turn class B has a type of class A. So what this actually makes this is what we call as a bidirectional relationship. In the sense, we have two classes and each of them actually have a reference to each other. Now, are there practical examples as to where we do it? Probably extremely less, right? There might be cases where we might need it, but it's extremely rare because it leads to this kind of coding or this kind of design leads to circular dependencies. So may not be the most popular way of how we go about writing various programs. So you've got to be careful before you select these various kinds of UML relationships, because it actually means something from a code perspective. But what we might actually have or do a lot more often in terms of the actual programming we write is in class A2 might have a reference to class B2, but B2 doesn't actually have a reference to class A2. So this is what we call as a unidirectional association or a directed association. So now note the arrow, the presence or absence of the arrow. In the first case, which is a bidirectional relationship, which is a bidirectional association, there are no arrows. It's basically trying to say both the classes are related to each other. Whereas in the second case, depending on the direction of the arrow in which you place, you are basically saying only one class actually has a reference to the other. So this is the first way of looking at, both are strong association, by the way. I've not yet talked about strong versus weak. Both are strong association, but the first one happens to be a bidirectional association, whereas the second one happens to be a unidirectional association. Okay, so I've just cleaned up the diagram and I've added the bidirectional strong association and unidirectional strong associations up here. Then let me talk about the weak association, and then we'll define what we mean by strong. Imagine this case where you actually have class C and you have three separate classes, class D, E, and F. And down below, I've given you code snippets, and I've written it in terms of Java, but it could have been any other O language. The code snippets are about the three methods that are defined within class C. Method 1 is actually taking class D as its argument and it's using it within its function somewhere. Method 2, M2, is not taking class C as an argument, but it is using class C within its local scope, within that particular method scope somewhere. Whereas the last method, M3, it is either creating class F itself or one of its dependent objects happens to return class F, and that class F itself is coming back as the return type of M3. So these are the three variants, these are the three main types of methods that we always write. So in this case, how do we go about saying what is the relationship between class C and D, E, and F? So in this case, we use what is called as dependency. I'm going to double click this and draw it between all these three. Now this, what we're writing, if you notice, first of all, notice the notational differences. In terms of a strong association, it is actually a line or no line, depending on bidirectional, unidirectional. But it had a solid line with an arrow, whereas in this case it is always a dotted line. Now, why is this called a weak reference, or why is the one that we looked at earlier called as a strong reference? And in order to answer that question, you got to look at where the dependent object was used. So if you look at this specific example between class C, D, and F, D, E, and F classes were, the scope of these were limited to one specific method each. It doesn't depend on how many methods it get used. As long as the scope of that particular object is limited to a method, it is called as a weak reference. So please note, in terms of UML, it's called as weak reference. Many of the tools also call this as dependency. But please be careful. Because of Spring and so many of the other dependency injection framework, the word dependency itself is overloaded, but please do not confuse that. Here, when we say dependency, we're talking about a dependent object whose scope is limited to a given method. So if the scope is limited to a given method, we call it as a weak reference or a dependency. If the scope of the dependent object happens to be at a member variable level, look at the example class B2, or look at the class B and class A here. The dependent objects happen to be, the scope of them happen to be at the member variable level. They are instance level, so to speak. And because of that, they're actually called as strong association, whereas this is called as a weak association, or in other terms, they're also called as dependency. Give me 2 minutes. I'll just clean this up, put them up front, and I'll come and close this particular video. Okay, here you go. I've cleaned up the diagram that I wrote. So in this particular video, we talked about association. There are two variants, so to speak, strong association and weak association. And in strong association itself could actually be bidirectional or unidirectional, but the dependent object that we're talking about, the scope of that dependent object is always at a member variable level or an instance level. Whereas in a weak association, the dependent object, the scope of that dependent object is always limited to a given method, and hence it's called as a weak association, or the other name used for it is also called as dependency. I hope these examples have actually been clear. And as I said earlier, I will put this export of this particular UML diagram for your reference as well. And in the next video, we will talk about aggregation.